Welcome to the Terrigal Public School ANZAC Day service for 2020. My name is Evie and I am one of the Terrigal Public School Senior Parliament Ministers. Angus, Chloe, Jet and I have the pleasure in leading you through the ANZAC Day service. Although you are watching this via a video link, it is important to acknowledge the incredible sacrifices made by the men and women who fought so hard for the freedom we enjoy today as Australians. Today, more than ever, we must come together as a community to overcome these challenging times, in the same way the ANZACS banded together many years ago. We will commence our assembly with the acknowledgement of country.
Terrigal Public School acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Dark and Kajung people. We recognise and pay our respects to elders both past and present, for they hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes of Aboriginal Australia. We further extend our respects to all Aboriginal people present today. We also acknowledge the future Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal leaders who we hope to grow and inspire at Terrigal Public School so they can pave a positive pathway in the future for all of Australia. We all have a responsibility to keep the land alive and will continue to care for and appreciate this land on which Terrigal Public School is built.
ANZAC Day is a day when we remember the landings of Australian and New Zealand soldiers on some beaches far away from Australian shores. These soldiers are most commonly known as ANZACs. The place where ANZACs landed is called Gallipoli, located in a country called Turkey. On ANZAC Day, throughout Australia, New Zealand and many parts of the world, ceremonies will be conducted to honour the memory of these brave soldiers.
On the morning of the 25th of April 1915, 36 large rowing boats loaded with Australian and New Zealand soldiers left the protection of the larger British ships and set off for the beaches of Gallipoli. They were about to invade Turkey. An hour and a half later, the first boats crunched against the rocks and sand of a place we now call ANZAC Cove. The soldiers scrambled ashore and started to climb up the steep slopes as enemy machine gun fire came down on them. Many were killed or wounded in the first few hours ashore.
In the dark, many of the boats had drifted off course and landed quite a long way away from where they should have been. They had in fact landed where the Turkish forces were the strongest and where the machine gun and artillery fire were thickest. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, some 12,000 men had landed. Later that day, some very brave Australians reached the heights overlooking the beaches. However, they were soon forced to turn back, never to return. Within a month, over half of those who had landed at Gallipoli were either dead or wounded.
For 7 long months, the ANZACs hung on to their position on the cliffs and slopes of ANZAC Cove. The Australians and New Zealanders could not go forward, but neither could the intrepid Turks force them back into the sea. In those months, a spirit developed amongst the soldiers, a spirit which relied on each soldier helping out his mates.
By the end of that year, 1915, some 32,000 Australians and New Zealanders had been killed or wounded at Gallipoli. The battle was a military failure. The ANZACs had lost and were forced to withdraw and leave Turkey. The battle was over. But in those months, when so many Australians had died from terrible conditions of heat and cold, of sickness, of suffering, of lack of sleep, and food and shelter. But in those months, the legend of ANZAC was born.
The ANZAC story we just heard shows us how important it was and still is to do our very best for our country, Australia, and to fight for what we believe is right. The story tells us that we must always be loyal to our country and to our friends, no matter what the cost, and to do everything as well as we possibly can. The example of the ANZAC soldiers and later generations of Australian service men and women should inspire us today. Those men and women believe in mateship, of helping out a mate or friend. They are determined and courageous people. They are true Australians.
ANZAC Day is not about painting war in a positive light. It is a reminder that war is horrible. And while we should be proud of what the ANZACs and other Australian soldiers have done, we should always remember that there are never any winners in wars. Every ANZAC Day we should remember all current and former members of the Australian Defence Force. I would now like to invite our Principal, Mr. Burgess, to address the Assembly.
Good morning, Terrigal Public School. It is Mr. Burgess speaking. I too acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Darkinjung Young people, and I pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present today. I also acknowledge the contributions and loss of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to conflicts throughout our country's history. Today we commemorate the contributions of so many to war efforts across many years. We do so at a time when we, ourselves, are challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic. I think many of us will use this commemoration of ANZAC Day 2020 to reflect on our freedoms. As we stay home, as our freedom of movement is restricted, as we miss the routine of school and work, as we find new ways to do the things we take for granted, I think there is a growing appreciation of the sacrifice of those that went to war to ensure the freedoms we normally enjoy. Throughout all of those conflicts, young and old, men and women, country folk and city folk, established Australians and new arrivals put their hand up to protect our country. They gave up their freedom in service of their country and for the generations to come. And for many, not only did they give up their freedom, they also gave up their life. I sometimes think we forget how lucky we are to be able to go where we want, to have our say on all topics, to have opportunities to succeed, to be able to learn and to connect with anyone, anywhere, anytime. Boys and girls, we are the beneficiaries of their sacrifice. So whilst we may currently grumble about not being able to go to the beach, not being able to go where we want, when we want, we have to remember that none of us is being asked to be shipped to another country, to live off rations, to spend most of your time in a trench, or to fight a war. So today, and again on the 25th of April, I want you to take time to reflect on all of those people whom gave up their freedom and those who gave their lives to make our country a great country. I ask that when we come out of these current restrictions that we redouble our efforts to live in peace, to honour the sacrifice of others by caring for our fellow Australians and living our lives respecting and valuing our freedoms, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. I would like to introduce Mr. Peter White from the Terrigal Womble Return Service Leagues, who has kindly donated his time to speak on our video about the importance of ANZAC Day.
Hello, Terrigal Public School. Thank you for the opportunity to join with you today for your ANZAC Day service. It's very important that we make a special effort, just as you have, to recognise ANZAC Day, because with all the difficulties that our country faces, it would be too easy to forget the debt that we owe to others for what we have today. Do you know that we've been recognising ANZAC Day for just over 100 years? Many of you may have had the opportunity to attend the dawn service at Terrigal, where thousands of people attend. Unfortunately, this year that won't happen. We gather on ANZAC Day to remember those that have served, and in particular, those that have died, so that we could have a better life. And despite our current problems, we in Australia do have a good life. Many countries don't. I'd like to ask you, when you have some time, to think how lucky you are, and to spare a moment to remember, in your own way, those that sacrificed their lives so that you could have a good one. Show that ANZAC spirit. Thank you again for allowing us to be a part of your service today.
Thank you, Mr. White. You will now be shown a short clip of Terrigal Public School students laying a wreath at the base of our flagpole. This wreath represents the memory of those soldiers who fought for our country.
In a moment, Jet will say the ode. After the ode, we will listen to the last post, which signals the end of the day's activities and ushers in a period of rest and quietness. This will be followed by a minute's silence. After the minute's silence, you will then hear the rouse, which signals the start of a new day and to awaken the soldiers. As a mark of respect, please stand for the ode and remain standing for a minute's silence, the rouse, and the national anthem.
At the completion of the ode, please repeat after me the words we will remember them. They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning we will remember them.
Please remain standing for the singing of the national anthem. You may be seated at the end of the anthem.
brings us to the end of our assembly. Thank you again to our special guest, Mr. White, for your contribution today. And thank you to the Terrigal Public School community for being a part of our ANZAC service for 2020.